Welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast, post-draft first round special, still mid-draft really, just 1/7 of it done so far. But we're here. I've got from the R&D team at SIS, Alex Vigderman, Stephen Polacheck, and from the ops crew, John Todd. As always, our producer Justin Stein is with us. But wow, that was quite a first round, guys, huh? I feel like, Stephen, we got to start off with the Jaguars homer. They had the first pick overall. How you feeling?
Well, I would say my disappointment is immeasurable and my day is ruined. No, to be honest, we knew this was coming. The beat was on it for the last 2 months. I'm not surprised at all. Very disappointed. I was really holding out hope for any of Thibodeau or Hutchinson coming into today. Ultimately, it looks like the power struggle in Jacksonville, actually, Trent Baalke is leading that team. So all the reports coming into today was Baalke loved Walker. He's the general manager. Doug Peterson, the new head coach, wanted to take Ike Ekwonu, and the owner of the team, Shad Khan, wanted to take Aiden Hutchinson. Ultimately, they go with Walker, who I'm really just not a big fan of, but the immediate anger reaction didn't really come out because it was expected. It was not an out of left field surprise, but can't say I'm excited when I know Hutchinson and Thibodeau are on the board.
Aside from personal feelings, I feel like at least with Travon Walker, Doug Peterson's been known to be analytically minded, and he's at least got physical tools, which tends to be something that the analytics folks can get behind a little bit. So maybe there's some hope there. At least there's upside. I guess we can say that.
Sure. Yeah. And I don't disagree with that, but hard to get on board with somebody who went number one, who didn't have 10 sacks in his entire college career, when that's your hope that he does that every season at the level higher.
But sacks are a quarterback stat, so we don't have to worry about that. But with this pick, and obviously, this was being discussed in advance, you could sort of like grapple with it in advance. But I was of two minds to some extent, because if you're in a draft where it's not necessarily like there's this one guy at the top that I absolutely must take, then you can sort of talk yourself into a toolsy player who can sort of play into that kind of disruptive athlete. But at the same time, if you are at 1-1 and you have this opportunity, well, if you're the Jaguars, you have this opportunity more often than other teams, but theoretically you're not going to have this opportunity again in the near future. And so do you need to make sure that you nail that pick? And do you need to avoid risk in that kind of situation? So I've been sort of ambivalent about the thought behind, sort of the optimism behind taking that pick.
And I'd say from the edge rusher perspective, between the three, I would say you could look at Thibodeau and Hutchinson as being more of the similar role, and you're kind of picking your style. I would say Travon Walker is the kind of guy where the Jaguars, I think a lot of what factored into it is that there's a lot more that you can do with him. Again, it's a lot of potential. That's what we're talking about with all of this stuff here. The production hasn't been there, but I think it's fascinating that so much of what he did, he could work in the inside. He could work off ball. He dropped some. He had some unbelievably freaky plays dropping into coverage, which is not something that you expect from an edge rusher going first overall. Not that they're going to be dropping him into coverage, but I just think the role that he would be playing with the Jaguars, I think they were probably intrigued by some of the other stuff that they could do with him, as opposed to just putting him at a wide 9 and letting him rush 98.
And what do you guys think, especially John and Stephen? What is his role with the Jaguars?
I think it's going to be very similar to that of what Josh Allen is. He's really athletic enough where you can move him around. And I know it gets tossed around all the time, the Swiss Army knife comparison, that he actually can drop back into coverage and not be a liability, or rush the passer, or be a good defender. I guess we are looking for we're just looking for good players. I do see it. I do see the upside. My complaints are more in terms of a team building perspective, because say if we were picking 10, I'd be happy with Walker as a pick, but I think he's going to just be the mirror image of Josh Allen.
You already kind of have a chess piece stand-up edge guy that you can maybe do some stuff with. Now you got two of them, as opposed to having one and then having kind of the anchor cornerstone edge. But that's what they're going to build off of, which I think is interesting. I think you can do more stuff with Walker on the inside. You do more stuff with Allen on the outside.
That's where I see the difference there. I feel like whereas Allen's more likely to drop, I feel like Walker is more likely to bump down into that 3.
Yeah, he can go anywhere.
Sort of like NASCAR package in.
He'll mug you up in the A gap and stuff too. Like there's some interesting stuff.
We've been saying interchangeable parts, positionless defense. It's coming to the NFL. Positionless offense too. Gotta love it. While we're on the Jaguars, Stephen, what do you think about Devin Lloyd at number 27?
A welcome surprise. He was somebody I did not expect to be on the board this late. I was not too happy when they let Miles Jack go for free. I thought he was, to what I said before, just looking for good players on the defensive side of the ball. And ultimately, you get a very, very younger version of him. We already have a tackle machine in Foye Oluokun as a free agent. So I think this is just a perfect pairing with him in the linebacker core. Very similar to what you said, positionless defense. He's very versatile, can do a lot of things.
Got some athletes now. Got some real athletes.
Very excited. And ultimately, looking at trade value, gave up equivalent of like a 4th rounder to come up. So really didn't break the bank to jump up the handful of picks. So while I'm not a fan of trading up, if it's that great of a fit, I can excuse that little bit. We can dive into that in a bit. But
I do think, if you're getting this positionless defense thing, Micah Parsons is sort of a counterexample to this, I suppose. But we have seen other examples in recent seasons of guys who had this sort of like Swiss Army knife profile, and they are not, at least initially, showing their potential. So these are the kinds of players that people will need to be a little bit patient with in terms of finding the right role, finding the right usage for that kind of guy.
And ultimately, the Jaguars are not looking to win the Super Bowl with these guys next year.
Yeah.
So you can let them learn NFL speed, figure out what their role is best served. But I'll tell you what, our defense is significantly better today than it was yesterday. And I think that's slam dunk.
That's what we're talking about here. All these guys have a key trait with versatility of the other stuff. And we talked about with Walker, with being an edge that can bump inside or drop some. Allen, we've talked about rushing off the edge, but can drop a little bit, kind of more the outside oriented. And Devin Lloyd is the off-ball linebacker who did a lot of legitimately putting his hand in the dirt and rushing. And his blitz percentage was up to 32% last year. I know I've looked into it for Parsons last year, was truly a 50-50 split for the Cowboys. There's some legitimate flexibility there. It's not just rushing off the ball. He could put his hand down and rush that way too. So, and then it has the sideline range off ball. So unique fits there. And there's a lot of different stuff. They're going to have a plan for these guys. I'd expect they do, being at number 1, knowing who they wanted to take, and then trading up for Devin Lloyd. They have a plan for these guys. So I'm fascinated to see how that works out.
Hope it's a good plan. I like the idea of not trying to win this year. I feel like they'll have a high success rate at that. Number 2, Aiden Hutchinson went to the Lions. I think they were thrilled to get Aiden Hutchinson there. Everybody kind of in agreement with that. Our number 1 player on the board. They seem to run with the card. All right. Number 3, Derek Stingley Jr. was kind of surprising, though, to the Texans. Don't really know how they're making their decisions these days, but I personally love this individual pick. He's a player that I think has as high an upside as anybody in this draft, and the injury risk is significant with the Linsfrake injury, but I'm kind of all about this pick. Were you guys shocked by it? Everybody thinking Sauce was going to come off first?
Certainly not shocked. I think that the fact that Gardner came off right afterwards, is really indicative of the fact that these guys probably were not necessarily interchangeable, but very similarly valued by teams. But the upside there, like this is sort of similar in the Walker sense of like taking a guy who might have a little bit more risk, but probably has a little bit more upside, as opposed to the guy who might be a little bit more of a sure bet in Gardner. So it's probably, I'd be curious to know what the Jets would have done if both of them were on the board in that spot. But I think, you can't argue with the upside there.
Yeah, definitely a pivot point in the draft right there. Hard to argue with like Gardner at 6'3" and with the arm length and his ability to press and not allowing any receptions for any yards ever. That's pretty good. But I'm still a Stingley guy. Any big reactions from you guys, or should we move forward to the Giants?
No, I thought it was a great pick. I think Stingley is one of those guys where you can try to talk yourself into other guys, and then you just get caught up in watching his best is as good as it gets. There's a reason why people thought he'd be the number one pick 2 years ago, and that's still in there. So I think for, again, a team like the Texans, that's not necessarily going to be winning right away, trying to find good pieces and everything. If you hit on that, that's a cornerstone right there.
It's probably an interesting modeling question for Steve and Alex going forward, because generally we're looking at like, what's your peak season? What's your most recent season? Trying to dissect that and understand what's going to be predictive. He's like one of these weird examples where he was super productive in his first season and then less so the last 2 years.
Yeah, one thing I definitely want to spend more time on, I guess, for next year is that sort of trajectory estimate of does both your playing time increase, does your performance increase, how does that relate to your outcomes? If your best year was prior to your platform season, what does that say about your prospects going forward? Obviously injury plays a factor a lot of the time, and I would think differently of a player who performed worse as a result of injury as opposed to just performing worse but having no injury to sort of fall back on. So accounting for that would definitely be relevant as well.
Right. Also, we're talking about super high variance cornerback play. Beware there too. Okay, Giants. They had the number 5 pick and the number 7 pick. When you talk about like the game theory of drafting, what they did seemed pretty reasonable. They picked Kayvon Thibodeau at number 5. They knew that they were going to have at least 2 of the 3 remaining tackles to choose from available to them at number 7. They ended up with Evan Neal, our second-ranked player in the draft. I put a blue chip grade on him. I think he's a great pick for the Giants. He can fit in 4 positions on their offensive line. Just don't try to put this 6'8" dude at center. Steven, I know you would have been happy with Thibodeau at number 1. Seems like the Giants might have been one of the teams that really, it's always great when you have 2 picks. Thank you, David Gettleman. But seems like they really came away as one of the big winners of this, at least in my perspective.
To be honest, Thibodeau and Neal were 2 of the 3 names I was throwing around as I want Jacksonville to take at 1. So if that tells you my opinion on these 2 guys, I think they were worthy of the number 1 pick. Giants walk away with a stud on both sides of the trenches. I really, really think the Giants come out as like the biggest winners of the night. They filled 2 giant holes. I think the thing with Neal is
nice.
You have a left tackle in Andrew Thomas, or at least he showed signs of that last year.
I think he's come around. I think he's a tackle. That's sure.
Right. And what Neal brings is experience at 3 different positions along the offensive line. So it's more of a get him in your camp and figure it out in training camp. Find your best alignment.
I don't know, John, I don't know if you agree, but I think if Neal becomes what he can become, you will find like you're going to want him at left tackle. He's that kind of like, his upside is it's Hall of Fame upside. And I don't say that lightly.
No, I know you don't. I think Neal's fantastic. And yeah, I mean, if it ends up being a thing where because maybe he's got a more comfortable transition to being on the right side because he's done it, he's played guard, he can do that. If that makes Andrew Thomas a better player, then so be it. But Evan Neal's going to be fantastic wherever they put him. And Thibodeau's got crazy upside. That's a really interesting fit there in New York. He's an interesting guy. Seems like he's been a polarizing guy in the process and everything. I think that could be a huge steal for them. But his detractors might say, I mean, New York City, who knows? Big, flashy guy, enjoys the spotlight. We'll see where that goes. But those are 2 huge picks for them. 5 and 7 were 2 guys that could have been right at the top of the draft there. Good way of handling that, especially with going Thibodeau first, like you said. And I think their GM said as much after the fact that they knew that there was maybe a bit of a drop after the edges with Thibodeau there. They didn't want to let that one go. They knew that they had a couple of cracks at tackle there. Worked out really well for them.
All right, going forward, or going in between rather. Number 6, Ekwonu went to the Panthers. Stop me if you guys have anything interesting here, because I feel like these are kind of interesting, but also like kind of sure.
I think it was mostly interesting that defensive players went with the first 5 picks. 3 edges. I think that's really interesting. Hasn't happened before. And then this is also the second straight year where no tackle has gone in the first 5 picks. We had Penei Sewell fall a little bit last year to number 6. This year, everybody's talking about the top 3 tackles being the big 3 guys. None of them go in the top 5. So
they go 6, 7, 9 though.
Yeah, third time in 4 years that we haven't had a tackle go in the top 5. And then you have 5 defensive guys in the top 5 this year. So it's an interesting trend there if it is a trend.
It's like the power of positional value was strong. I guess now is a good time that we can talk about quarterbacks a little bit because they just didn't go. Like the lack of quarterbacks, which to me, my reaction to that is like, great job, NFL. You guys, you didn't bite the cheese. You didn't do that whole thing. Like you stayed true to your boards. You didn't reach. I thought that was nice to see that there were good players and they came off the board ahead of where these quarterbacks probably should have come. So I was encouraged by that. But aside from the fact that the NFL didn't think they were great quarterbacks this year, positional value was like, okay, the next most important things are corners and edge rushers, and we're going to load up on those dudes. And then the next most important thing after that is tackles and wide receivers, and we're going to load up on those dudes. It was very like 2022 NFL.
Yeah, and you filled in the off-ball linebackers and stuff at the back end, and you got your quarterback, and you got your positional. You filled out all your positions as things went on. You got your center, but yeah, it was definitely like a couple of positions absolutely dominated the top half of this draft.
Going forward, at number 8, the Falcons took Drake London. That was a bit surprising to me. They'll be kind of fun. Kyle Pitts and Drake London having kind of 2 power forwards out there.
Hit them in the red zone.
Yeah, pretty difficult.
If they can get to the red zone.
Yeah, right. But sometimes, the team building philosophy, as you know, John, is you want to build that receiver room to have almost like a basketball team. You want to have your little guys. You want to have your big guys. You want to have your guys that can kind of be your slashers and work the middle of the field. All of the different roles filled. These are definitely big catch radius, big go up and get it. Now, they both can run. So it's not like they're one-trick ponies in that sense. Like we're not talking about kind of statue receivers here. They're not tight ends. Well, one of them is, but nominally. You get my drift here.
And don't throw away the fact that in a year, you're still going to get Calvin Ridley back to round this all out. That I don't think they drafted Mariota with their sights set on a Super Bowl this year. I think very similarly, this is let's get better. Let's find building blocks. And you're seriously going to come into next season with a Ridley, London, Pitts receiving room for whoever quarterback you're able to acquire in this next offseason. I don't want to put shade on Mariota like that, but
no, you can do it. It's deserved. No, you're right. The receiver room and really does bring that different element there, a little bit more of that route runner doing a different thing to the defense. So that is exciting, assuming they can round out the rest of their team.
So what do we make of London being the first receiver off the board? Was that given that there were a bunch of guys in that sort of top tier, was that surprising at all, or?
A little bit. I think a big thing is this top of the receiver class was very much kind of take your flavor, whatever you like.
Yeah.
And it does sound like from what I've heard of other teams and how this was all handled, it sounds like Drake London was at the top of a lot of boards. A lot of teams really liked him. Speaking of the basketball style of building a team, he was a legitimately excellent basketball player in high school, played on the USC basketball team. He's not just, I do have some pause just because his best trait is being a contested catch guy, and you'd like a guy to not have to rely on that as much in the NFL. You'd like to have him a bit more separation before the fact, but he's got the after catch stuff more so than you would expect. The big body, there weren't a lot of, for all of the traits that are in this class of receivers, there weren't a lot of big body receivers. And so that bumped him up as well. People weren't worried about the foot injury. And I think he checked a lot of boxes off in terms of his career progression, where he came in true freshman, dominated an air raid offense, but from the slot, did a lot of stuff from there, moved to the outside, contested catch guy. He's a possession receiver, but he's got big plays. He just didn't check off the box of speed. But other than that, met a lot of the things that you're looking for. And it sounds like a lot of teams really looked into that, him being their number one receiver. So the Falcons just sat there and took him.
I think you summed it up when you said speed, because speed kills. And that's what's surprising about him being the first one of them off the board. But at the same time, there was no all around everything wide receiver in this draft. There was no Jamar Chase. There was no all of that sort of thing. So I think you're right when you say they pick their flavor, and it's kind of an interesting flavor depending on how they end up building out that quarterback position.
I will admit to being a little bit in the tank for Drake London because of the article I wrote a week or two ago where I was looking at performance against press coverage and how that's a pretty predictive thing in recent history of success at the NFL level. And in fact, both London and Kyle Pitts were in the top 10 in yards per route run against press coverage in their last couple years. And that, that also included names like Devontae Smith, Jamar Chase. So if that is in fact as predictive of a thing as it has appeared to have been in the last couple of years, that's good news for him.
Going back to what you had mentioned earlier about kind of the stylistic preferences of teams, where it's interesting that you can either build a basketball team where you have like your small point guards, you have your bigger guys, and just kind of line it up a 1 through 5, where they went with two fairly similar guys in Kyle Pitts. I've honestly heard Drake London comped to some more like H-style athletic tight ends. He's not that, obviously, as a receiver, but played tighter alignments a lot, and he's kind of the more receiver body type, but there are a lot of similarities there. So it's interesting. We'll get into some other comps as we talk about these other receivers and where they went and how those teams are building out their receiver rooms. But the Falcons went with a couple of similar guys there, as opposed to going with maybe a more speed guy in Jameson Williams or a smoother receiver or whatever else. So I think that's interesting and stuff that we'll talk about with each team having a different philosophy for building their receiver room.
And in case people missed it, check out that article by Alex. It's on sportsinfosolutions.com. The article is called How Receiver Productivity in College Relates to NFL Outcomes. Really interesting stuff, especially as it pertains to press coverage. Tons of reasons that get explained in the article about why that may be predictive and what's super interesting about that specific split when you're looking at these receivers as NFL prospects. All right, moving forward. Charles Cross went off at number 9 to the Seahawks. I think we all like that pick a lot. Nice left tackle of the future for them.
Yeah, I just like the sort of irony of taking a guy who, did a lot of pass blocking for a team that didn't do a lot of pass blocking with Russell Wilson, and now doesn't have Russell Wilson and probably will still continue not doing a lot of pass blocking. But
you have a good sense of irony, Alex.
Yeah.
Number 10, Garrett Wilson off the board to the Jets. Seems like a good fit there. They seem to have the weapons, at least now, going forward. We started to get our receiver run at this point. Number 11, the Saints traded up, and they took Chris Olave. I don't know if there were any big takes on that move.
I thought it was a slight reach to not just take him at 11, but to give up a couple picks to do it. But he's a silky smooth route runner, and he doesn't have much yards after catch ability or big playability or anything like that. But they clearly value route running separation is something that they definitely value in that receiver room and everything. And it was just an interesting guy to target to move up to 11 with some other guys that were still there. But yeah, definitely a receiver run here, which is tackles went. This is about where we thought the receivers could go. Commanders move back, Saints move up. This is the first trade outside nope trades in the top 10. And then we had 9, I think, rest of the draft, which got a little crazy here.
Got nuts.
Yeah, starting here was when things got really crazy.
So not just a receiver run, former receiver teammate run, if you count Jameson Williams having been teammate with Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave. Kind of crazy when you think about that. And then also before we get moving on to that Detroit pick at number 12, because I think it's even more interesting, the Saints, Chris Olave at number 11, Trevor Penning at number 19, Dennis Allen going offense in his first draft post Sean Payton. Any strong reactions there? That was kind of interesting to me.
The interesting part of it, and maybe the answer is it's not interesting, is they pretty much plugged their 2 gigantic holes that you could point to with that team. You say, evidently, they definitely need a wide receiver, and they just lost Teron Armstead and definitely need a tackle. And as unexciting as it may be, and they do lose a decent amount of value, about a high 3rd round pick in that trade to move up to go get Olave. But ultimately, the move wasn't for a quarterback when they traded a bunch for the Eagles. So I guess my assumption walking away from this is they truly do believe in Jameis Winston to carry them over the hump, because they don't have a fix. They gave up 2nds and 3rds and a lot to be able to land these 2 guys and plug these 2 holes. So a very interesting take.
The Jameis Winston part's not hard for me. What I wonder is who's going to play left tackle for them. Is it going to be Penning, or is Ramczyk going to move over there? I wonder how they'll work that out, because they both kind of seem like ideal right tackles to me, at least right now, plugging in for 2022.
Yeah, Penning on the surface profiles more as a right tackle, just toughness and kind of what you think of stereotypically and everything. But he's a crazy athlete. He's very underrated. I've seen going around that it's funny that the most athletic tandem tackles in college football history was at Northern Iowa when they had Spencer Brown and Trevor Penning based on testing numbers and everything, which is fascinating. So he can do it. It'll be interesting to see how that works. Yeah, I was going to mention that, speaking of just kind of the whole need fit and best player available, you always talk about need factors in, but you're taking best player available. That's what the best teams do and everything. You look at the picks in the first round, sure does match up with a lot of needs. You just go down the list of a lot of teams that the media were picking, like this team needs a tackle and a receiver. They went with those two picks. The Steelers need a quarterback. They went with the quarterback. Teams need corners or edge rushers at the front or whatever. Just a lot of natural fits there. I think a lot of this first round made sense.
Yeah, and we wonder why teams miss so often.
I think in the first round, I would be surprised if it doesn't look like that a lot of the time, because yeah, you'd prefer to take the best player available, but oftentimes there aren't like large differences in your measurement of who the best player is. And so you have a bunch of players you can choose from. And if you have a bunch of players you can choose from, then you might as well pick one that fills a hole that you have. So I think that in a lot of cases, you sort of like are looking for best player available and sort of happen into the filling a whole thing just because there aren't large differences in at least like how you'd measure the quality of the player.
I think that makes sense. And like another way to think of that is just like, maybe that's what is to be expected. Like maybe it's like a logical fallacy that we all fall into, that like, because if I'm not going to draft a quarterback or a defensive end because I feel like I'm set at those positions, and there's a fairly efficient market in terms of what we think is valuable out there, then it makes sense that I'm going to draft a position that's a need position, quote unquote, when I pick, because that position was actually just a position where I had an opening and there were players available because other teams didn't have openings, and on and on.
Yeah. And if your goal is to improve your team, then
which it is. And we should distinguish between need-based drafting and finding a fit and not finding players that don't upgrade your roster. There's a difference between just picking somebody because you have a need and picking somebody because in the context of your team, this will elevate you more than another player.
Yeah, and actually this will blend into the Eagles pick of Jordan Davis as well. But you wanted to talk about Jameson Williams first, so I will.
All right, let's talk about Jameson Williams. Not because of Jameson Williams at all. I think he's a fantastic player, but I think the trade is more interesting because there seem to be some different reactions to the value here. So I want to turn to the expert, the man who made the total points draft value chart, Stephen Polacheck. You've calculated the points. I can tell you how they add up on this trade, but does how the points add up with your understanding of whether or not this was a good trade for the Lions, who I will give the details real quick. They moved up from number 32 to number 12. And they also picked up pick number 46, but they gave up their second and third at number 34 and early in the third round as well.
Interestingly enough, the pick differential comes out to be an early fourth rounder. So ultimately, Minnesota does win in the trade value chart, which to the reason of the chart is to say, well, Minnesota, you won that trade. You added more expected value than you had before, so you would win the trade. Now, the one thing that trade or that value chart doesn't factor in is the upside. So what does Detroit think that their upside at that pick number 12 can exceed the expected value that sits there? So they ultimately take Jameson Williams, which at least was in a position of high importance as what we were talking about just before. These are the cornerstone pieces that we're seeing teams chase. My gut reaction immediately was, if you're going to trade up, that's quite a jump where you didn't have to pay a lot. Let's not forget, a year ago, Chicago traded away a first rounder that ultimately ended up being, I think, number 7 this year. They moved that just to move up a couple spots. Now, they were coming up for a quarterback, but we've seen it where the price being multiple first round picks, or I should say a first round pick on top of what you're already giving up to move up. So you're essentially giving in 2 firsts for 1 first, and the Lions walk away. Now that second round pick is pretty high, but to come up that significantly far and only give up about a 4th round pick in value, I think that's as good of a win as you can get in a trade up. But we'll visit that Jet scenario later.
So you're going against your own chart. It was 77.6 points of trade value versus 67.5, a 10-point difference on the total points scale. Seems like you took an interesting route to take the apologist for going against the scale and saying that it was about upside, because I would have gone for the kind of second argument that you made, which is basically in terms of market value, they did very well. In terms of what other teams have paid, in terms of the Jimmy Johnson chart, they did pretty well in those regards. So yeah, relative to what people would be expected to pay, but ultimately I like the deal for the Vikings, especially if they didn't feel like there was a player that was enough of a value that they wanted to go for it right there. Move down, take that 10 extra expected points or total points and call it a day.
Now, what's very interesting is they made this trade with Kyle Hamilton sitting on the board. So he was on the board, the pick got to them, and a very commonly mocked spot was Kyle Hamilton going to Minnesota because he did fit that need of safety. Well, they actually moved down, and I don't want to jump ahead of it, but since we're talking about the trade, they did take a safety in Lewis Seen from Georgia. So they did go and find the safety. So if you're sitting in that draft or in that war room and you're looking at a trade value chart similar to this and whose GM came up through the analytics ranks, let's not ignore that fact. Maybe he does really value a second and third round pick like the trade value chart says. But if they're thinking there's not as steep of a fall off between Seen and Hamilton, then I think that's a slam dunk for Minnesota then. So really, I think this trade, you can make an argument for both sides winning individually, which is very interesting when you throw on the fact that they're also in division, which is, I don't know. I was surprised to see this. I keep talking myself more into both sides as the more I talk. So
then it must have been a fair deal.
Seems to be that case.
And that's like a weird thing in sports, I think, that teams don't want to trade in their division. Like if you're making a trade that you think makes your team better and you don't think it makes the other team better, which you might want to avoid, but like assuming you think you're like quote unquote winning the trade, I don't understand why you wouldn't want to do that. So I don't know.
Well, and this isn't an example like this, but I can imagine a team that's like tanking and they're selling off their parts and stuff like that. Well, yeah, it actually would be even better if you traded within your division, because then if you think that player is still good, they can beat you for you.
Yeah, we're really happy to lose to you this game.
Yeah.
All right. Speaking of being really happy to lose, a team that's famous for that, the Eagles. They drafted Jordan Davis at number 13. Alex, what do you got?
So this is an example of not drafting for need necessarily. I mean, this is a team that has really had a lot of success drafting and acquiring, Javon Hargrave last offseason and really making that defensive front a strength. And Davis is a different kind of player than they've had. And he, you hear people talk about him sort of like changing the geometry. Of course, a guy that size changes the geometry of a lot of things. He's a gravitational pull, but being able to, with Fletcher Cox potentially departing, not, maybe they make a deal with, getting rid of him in advance of this season, but at a very minimum, he's probably on his way out in the next year or two. And so that interior, that defensive line does have some possibility of being reshaped. And Davis does give an opportunity to do that and, eat up a lot of double teams and free guys up on the edge, free linebackers up to make plays. And so he does sort of change the way that you play your defense, assuming that he's, on the field and productive as you'd hope.
Potentially. I could also see them playing him as a single gap player, not the same player as Fletcher Cox, but a similar deployment in terms of what do you do with him. Like, yes, this guy could be your prototypical true nose tackle, but at the same time, I don't think this is a player without get off and without the ability. My question is, does he have the stamina to stay on the field? I think will be the big question for me. Your first point, I think, was the spot on one. This is not team need. This is a team that is drafting a position that they value in the draft. They value defensive linemen. They've continued to value defensive linemen for the last, I don't know how many years. And you want to make your strengths stronger, not just feed your weaknesses, which is another argument against need-based drafting. So I love it in that sense.
It will be interesting to your point about, how if you make him a one gap player, like you can do that with this defensive front and make it very scary. Like part of the reason why Hargrave was able to succeed this year was because he was playing off of Cox. And so having all three of them now makes that interior defensive line like incredibly scary. And Davis doesn't have to play as many snaps because those other guys are on the field. And so he is really set up well to succeed in this, first year or two. Though I will say that as an Eagles fan who observed them trading up to take Brandon Graham instead of taking Earl Thomas however many years ago, and seeing Earl Thomas have the career he had, and seeing Kyle Hamilton on the board and not taking him and coming up to take Davis, there's a little bit of a parallel there that hopefully works out a little bit better in the Eagles' favor. Obviously, Graham ended up being a pretty productive player, but the first few years there looked pretty awful.
Yeah, and you brought up Kyle Hamilton, and that we get to another one of the teams. We talked about the Giants before. I love the Ravens first round. Kyle Hamilton and Tyler Linderbaum working right up the middle, building like a baseball team. I know, Alex, you love that based on your old past there. But two of the strongest players in the class come right in, first-year starter type guys. You have no questions about that. I think they really fit the Ravens mentality in a lot of ways. They fit the team in the way that they want to play, and they want to beat people up. Linderbaum kind of fit following in the Marshall Yanda footsteps there. Kyle Hamilton obviously was one of our top 3 blue chip players in the draft. Are you guys with me? Do you love this Ravens draft?
It was a classic day for Baltimore. Just let the draft come to them, sit at 14, don't have to move anywhere, get Kyle Hamilton. Then they essentially move back 30 spots in the 4th round to trade Hollywood Brown for Tyler Linderbaum. And just moving forward, it happens every year. I don't know how it keeps happening. Just classic for them. I guess the only issue is that they might have to win Lamar Jackson back over. He didn't seem too happy on Twitter, but otherwise, I think everybody else, I sure loved it. It was a fantastic first day to get two really high-end guys in Hamilton and Linderbaum right up the middle.
So what do you think of Linderbaum? He's obviously a little bit more of like a stylist. He has a particular style to his play and his fit with an offense, and with the Ravens having a sort of unique offense. I'd be curious, John, of your opinion of that fit.
Yeah, he's going to be a guy who's on the move. So he's mostly a zone blocker, but that doesn't mean that he can't play in a gap scheme as long as you're putting him on the move. I comped him to a Jason Kelce type, where Jason Kelce's not really going to be like your bowling ball as a down blocker, but he can be your lead blocker as a puller from the center position, which gives you a lot of unique opportunities in the running game, which we all know the Ravens love to do. I mean, snap it from shotgun and pull Linderbaum out into space with Lamar Jackson behind him. That's going to happen a lot next year. But then just the zone stuff, left and right, like just having a guy with that mobility up the middle, he's very unique. And the way that he moves, he's not a powerful guy. He's not going to overpower you too much, but he's a hard worker as an anchor player, undersized, short arms, that whole thing, but just really interesting athlete and a smart dude and everything. And you can just do so much of them on the move in space, which the Ravens have a plan for. Like that's absolutely what they're looking forward to doing. Having their bigger tackles. They've got some bigger guys on the edges there that they will down block. They've got guys that were tackles that have converted to guard. They've got some really thick guys on outside of Linderbaum that can help out. And so those guys will be the ones that'll be banging in the middle, and they can flip Linderbaum and move him around, do all that kind of stuff. Let Linderbaum get free and move up to the second level. I think it's a really good fit, even though it's not necessarily like your true zone, like Kyle Shanahan style zone team. That doesn't mean that he's not a good fit. I think there's going to be a plan there. I think he's going to be an awesome fit in that offense.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think that it's easy to misconstrue that, like, okay, he's athletic, he should be his own scheme. He's powerful, he should be in a gap scheme. But that's really not true. And a lot of times, especially when you're talking about that center position in particular, you can sort of mask some things from a play strength perspective by being in that gap scheme, because you get those natural double teams, because you get those trap blocks and those pullers moving a lot. And John, I think you're spot on when you say that he's going to be the guy on the move a lot of the time. It makes me think of some of the old Wildcat stuff that Miami used to do. And, I picture all kinds of tackle pulls and weird things like that. I think the center pull will be a heavy part of their offense for sure.
So I'm curious, because I'm a little confused as to what this Ravens team is going to look like next year. So I hear a lot of, well, they want to run the ball. They're a running team. They were actually 9th in the league last year in pass attempts, and they were up towards the top in the games just with Lamar Jackson. Now, they were down both Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins. So you can give a little bit of argument to that. I guess I'm looking at that as, okay, so maybe they do want to throw the ball. And I don't know if I'm on record on this podcast, on record saying I think Lamar Jackson is actually a very good passing quarterback. So I'm very interested in it. Seemed like last year they flipped to being a bit more interested in the pass. And then today they draft a center and they flip their field stretching wide receiver. Now I'm a huge Rashad Bateman fan and Mark Andrews is awesome, but I'm just a little confused as to what that offense is going to look like next year, because you're supposed to get those running backs back and you've made your receiver room shallower. Now I think they have something like 7 fourth-round picks or something like that at this point. So there's plenty of depth to be had, but I really can't figure out what that team's going to look like next year. I'm interested if any of you have a sense of that, because they did pass the ball a lot more than I want to say the public narrative has.
Well, I think they're a 21 personnel team, so I don't think they're primarily looking to necessarily play with 3 receivers on the field. So, I think that they feel like Bateman, Prochet, they have decent receivers there, but I definitely agree with you that the outside receivers are not a strength. I wonder if they're going to add somebody at this point, maybe try to make a trade. It seems like receivers are very available, but yeah, I mean, the trade that they made was a pretty surprising one, right? I'm not sure where I come out on that one. I don't know if you guys had strong feelings.
It's a little odd. Certainly I suppose whenever you trade one of your receivers, the quarterback isn't going to be that excited. But I do think that the nature of having a draft that's over 3 days leads us to some funky conclusions. Like they have a pick in the middle of the second round. They could easily take one of the guys that we have as graded as, starting level guys at that pick, or trade up a couple spots to secure one of those players, and suddenly we're having a different conversation. So it is sort of an incomplete grade for them, especially giving that they traded away Brown. But this is an offense that should be able to be creative enough and really do some interesting things with the running game, where I'm less concerned than I might have been with another team trading away a player like that.
I've been thinking about it over the time Alex was thinking, and I'm good with it because I think Brown, at his stage of his career, I think they decided that they didn't want to pay him a second contract, and they got out in front of it, basically.
I was just going to throw in the fact that in our trade value chart, the difference that Hollywood Brown comes in at pick 59. So if you're Arizona, would you take him at pick 59 in this draft?
And pay him?
Yes.
Right. The difference is you're missing a few years of cheap labor, so to speak.
And that's what was traded, right? That's what was traded.
And I think the context of within minutes of each other, I know Warren Sharp pointed this out, that within minutes of each other, the Cardinals got Marquise Brown in pick 100 for number 23. And then the Eagles got A.J. Brown for 18 and 101. Yeah. So essentially the difference is a late 3rd round pick. Obviously the contract is going to be a big factor in that. They immediately paid A.J. Brown a humongous contract, but they're obviously the Cardinals. I thought it was a surprising move. I think they're clearly banking on the Kyler Hollywood Brown relationship from college. Kingsbury said as much after the fact, that Kyler's wanted to play with him since they played in college and everything. That's been something that he's kind of petitioned for. So I think they're weighing a lot with that. Just with, again, minutes apart, those two things happen, and you're immediately looking towards the A.J. Brown one as I don't know if you could have had that. I don't know if that was an option. Clearly they didn't want to pay Hollywood. There's the contract factor. But.
Kevin Durant thought it was a good idea to bring in Kyrie Irving and James Harden. So
yeah. So is this, I hadn't even thought about that. Is this like a Kyler contract negotiation ploy? Oh man.
Yeah, no, but one thing that's clear is I think we all are in agreement that the A.J. Brown value seems great in that direction, and the Hollywood Brown seems in the other direction, if anything.
I do want to make a note on this A.J. Brown thing, which is just less of I don't know what the right word is, maybe an observation, that clearly this trade had to have been negotiated and has been sitting on the table, because obviously if he signed his extension, it's been sitting there. So I'm very surprised that I want to say a shout out to the Tennessee and Philadelphia front office. I had no idea this was a thing. There was no rumblings of it. I mean, the speculation was A.J. Brown might be seeking a trade because they don't want to pay him, but nothing to this extent. It kind of just dropped out of nowhere. And trade value, I have it going for basically the equivalent of the 7th pick, which is quite a jump. But I think if you're Philadelphia, who's been looking for a receiver for a long time, it's you get a stud, you have space to pay him. It's a monster deal, but you're looking at a franchise cornerstone for the next 4 years for that team.
Yeah, you got to pay him, but you gave up a lot less than some of the other wide receiver trades that we've seen this offseason. I mean, you can argue about like the different values of all these different guys, but that was less than a few of the other ones that we've seen.
Yeah, my only concern with that trade and the subsequent contract is if Jalen Hurts isn't the guy and you just paid a bunch of money to a receiver for a team that's not really in a position to contend, that would be my biggest concern.
Well, you are loaded up with 2 first rounders next year. I think that's
part of it.
Yeah.
One of them belonging to the Saints.
Yeah. So the argument there, I guess that I would make is, yes, you're loaded up to be able to get a guy next year, but presumably you're not contending in that first year, if that's the case, when he's a rookie. And so you're waiting multiple seasons, and then, then you're only getting maybe 2 years of the Brown contract that are really relevant to the next guy. I don't know. It's a little bit, nervous making as an Eagles fan who does not have the greatest confidence in the current quarterback situation.
Well, pause. Who said it had to be a rookie? With the way things are going,
sure. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
It doesn't have to be a rookie.
Sure.
I'm not going to say Russell Wilson's going to get traded, but if you said a year ago Russell Wilson's going to be a Denver Bronco, I think it would be pretty shocking for most of us. So the landscape changes quickly. Might not have to be a rookie.
All right, let's fast forward through the rest of the first round. Kenyon Green and Zion Johnson, a couple of guards go surrounding Jahan Dotson. Penn State guy going to join the Communist Party of Washington. Any big reactions from our Nittany commies in attendance?
Speak for the commies. I'll do my quick commander spiel. I don't mind it, especially moving back and getting a couple mid-rounders. They were lacking a 3rd and a 5th rounder. Kind of made sense that they'd either try to move back to fill in some mid-round picks where that's kind of the strength of this draft, or move back and try to get something next year, which was something I was going to note. For all the movement tonight, unless I missed something, I don't think a single pick for next year was traded, which I think is interesting. Teams may be protecting some ammo for a year that might be stronger in quarterbacks people are talking about, but I don't think there are any future picks traded tonight, despite all the big moves and Vikings moving back 20 spots and everything. So thought that was interesting. But yeah, picking up a couple more mid-rounders. Dotson's fantastic ball skills, more explosive offensively was my big thing with them. And they did that. He's a smaller target for sure. Going with the stylistic differences, it's an interesting insight in their wide receiver philosophy. I saw P. Haley in DC noted that Ron Rivera's drafted 11 receivers since he's been a head coach, and 8 of them have been under 6 feet tall. And so their receiving core is Terry McLaurin, Curtis Samuel, and Jahan Dotson. Bit of a smaller group, but more explosive, kind of playmakers, ball skills, that whole thing. And then you go back to like the Lions, which we touched on the trade, but not necessarily the player. I think Jameson Williams is a fantastic fit there. That's one of my favorite fits in the first round, because that's the difference of receivers there, where you have, when he's healthy, Jameson Williams is the speed guy. You got Amon-Ra St. Brown as the possession guy, the route runner and everything. And you got TJ Hawkinson over the middle. Like that's a receiving core. That's an offense there. You find, again, a team that's not necessarily going to win right now. You can kind of wait for Jameson to get healthy, no rush there, find a quarterback next year. That can be the building of something. But I like the Jahan Dotson move. They've all got the kind of inside out interchangeability too, those 3 guys in the receiving core. So interesting fit. We'll see what happens with the rest of it, but I thought that was fine. And then I think the guard picks were good too. I know I had Zion Johnson going to the Chargers in our SIS mock draft. Shout out for that. We had a few good hits there. So really impressive kid from everything I've seen. I think he's just going to be a rock solid player for him. Protecting Herbert up front is a big need, obviously beyond Slater. They didn't have much there. So that was a big need in the first round.
To speak from the Nittany Lion perspective for Jahan Dotson, earlier than we had expected.
For sure.
I did not expect him to be going at 16.
He didn't either. He said as much though. I think he said he was watching the playoff game on his phone when he got a phone call tonight.
What's interesting I don't want to say interesting. We do all these mock drafts, and pretty much in most of the exercises I saw, it was he's going to Green Bay or he's going to Kansas City. A lot of those teams, obviously, people aren't projecting trades. So when teams need wide receivers and they're sitting in that ballpark, he's going to get mocked there a lot. And we're sitting here going, oh, wouldn't it be so wonderful if he could catch passes from Patrick Mahomes? And unfortunately, he goes to a Carson Wentz-led offense, which I think is a perfect equivalent to Sean Clifford. And not to get in a Penn State rant, but sometimes you get an awesome quarterback who's lights out, and then sometimes you get a guy that you just can't wait to get off the field. And I just think that's quite a funny comparison.
We talked about the Titans trade before. We didn't talk about Treylon Burks. He was our top receiver in our crowded receiver board this year. And, with Dotson, with Burks, I think, you talked about the crowded receiver room a minute ago for the commies. But I think that's when you see the amount that receivers are getting paid out there, it makes sense, right? It makes sense to keep rebuilding there. This isn't quarterbacks where if we draft a rookie, then we're going to worry about upsetting our starter and not be able to get them snaps. You need multiple wide receivers. So you might as well position yourself to not have to pay them $25, $30 million, or to do that if you really want to do that. So maybe there's some upside to Treylon Burks filling the role of A.J. Brown. I think, John, would you agree he could fill that similar archetype? I know it was all Deebo Samuel, but A.J. Brown maybe not so far off.
Absolutely. And it was actually funny. I saw Corey March on Twitter made the same joke that I did in our football chat, that kind of like the Family Guy joke of, you look behind this door, like anything could be behind this door. It could even be a boat. Like you could have AJ Brown, or maybe this guy could become AJ Brown. That's kind of the running joke. But he does, again, he's like the Deebo Samuel comp was out there. He'd be a bigger Deebo Samuel. Bigger Deebo Samuel sounds a lot like AJ Brown. I mean, that's kind of the archetype there. That's clearly what their plan was. If you're not going to extend AJ Brown, if you don't want to do that, you want to save all the money. That's kind of what everybody's talked about with like the Jets. If they had traded for Deebo tonight, the price difference and how much you'd be paying him per year versus how much the 10th overall pick makes the next few years or whatever. So that's obviously a big factor. And so they hope that Treylon Burks, from a yards after catch standpoint, from a big body playmaking standpoint, he's got the combination there. We were not alone in having him as the number one receiver. Again, it was a lot of like just kind of whatever your flavor is. He's definitely an interesting guy, unique guy. And I think he does fit a pretty, not a 1-for-1 comp, not to say he's AJ Brown, but the body type, the yards after skills, that's stuff that can translate right away for sure.
Yeah, 6 receivers between 8 and 18. So really, really not a lot separating these guys there. Clearly, like we said the whole time, it was different flavors.
I would think that they probably valued him towards the top of that group. And so when he fell to that point, they're saying the value here is too great. We're not getting anywhere with AJ. Let's work this out.
100%. That's usually how it works. All right. We got our quarterback at number 20. It was Kenny Pickett to Pittsburgh. I feel like on a podcast, I might have mentioned that I thought that would be a good fit, not really thinking that it would happen. I was convinced that the teams were going to overvalue these quarterbacks and take them higher. I think this is really interesting because if you're going to be worried that you're Pittsburgh drafting a quarterback with small hands and you're worried about his ability to handle the weather in Pittsburgh, what better than a guy that's been in your facility like every day for the last however many years? Like, this seems to me like they're going to know the character really well. They're going to know about his ability to handle the weather and it's a good fit in terms of a team that's really not trying to be built based on trying to throw the ball more than you, trying to outpass you in kind of the Steelers mentality. They have a great defense that's pretty well built right now. I think that their running back's pretty good and kind of you can work in the pieces. And just like when they won with Ben Roethlisberger, it would be a defense first type of system. So I'm intrigued by the pick, even though I didn't love the player. Like as far as a fit goes, I was pretty into this one.
Yeah, as long as you're, as you mentioned, if you're not using that extra draft capital to trade up to get this kind of player earlier in the draft, you're just letting it sit and come to you with the second half of the first round, I think it's totally reasonable to take a guy there. And if you like Pickett more than Willis, go for it. And we're analytics forward here, but how can you not like the Pitt guy going to the Steelers? Like there's something warm and fuzzy about that obviously doesn't win you football games, but does yeah, maybe it has some extra value in terms of ticket sales and morale and all these sorts of things that are,
I think it's knowing the kid. I think it's
sure.
And it's not the same city. It's the same damn building. They've got to know this kid really well.
There's the Mark Whipple connection. I think one of his best games that he played in college last year was in that monsoon against UNC. I think it was overtime game, weather factors in Pittsburgh at Heinz Field, the whole thing. Yeah, I think he checks off a lot of those boxes. I think it's interesting that, they paid Mitch Trubisky a decent amount of money. I don't think that's a guaranteed starting job for Kenny Pickett. I think that's going to be an interesting camp battle. I think Mitch Trubisky's got his fans in the league from what he did as a backup last year for the Bills and just how he was kind of handled as a free agent this year. So I think that'll be interesting this year for two guys that I think there's a lot of similarities here, guys with a bit of mobility. Yeah, that'll be a good one this summer. Training camp battle between those two guys, see who comes out.
A note to make on top of what John just said is I remember the quote from Trubisky was he was looking for the place that would give him the best opportunity to compete for a starting job. He did not sign with the Steelers under any impression that he was going to be handed a starting job. So I think it like John said, it truly will be a camp battle as to who ends up being the starter come this fall.
He's legally obligated to say that, though, right?
Andy Dalton came out last year and said, I was told I'm going to be the starter. So who knows?
Yeah, I guess they learned their lesson based on that one. The Andy Dalton comps are interesting. Into the 20s. Which picks were really interesting from you here? At 21 and 30, the Chiefs got Trent McDuffie and George Karlaftis filling two big needs on their defense. I think they're obviously giving up some capital, but two really good fits, I think, in terms of them trying to compete.
Yeah, and if you're giving up capital, this is the kind of team that wants to be doing that. You're
right, now's the time.
Yeah, you're in win now mode. You're in an AFC that has a lot of high-powered passing games, and you want to get after the quarterback and you want to defend on the back end. And so these are, the Bills did something similar a couple picks later. Just get guys who are well suited to the kind of competition you're going to be facing, and that those snaps are going to be important because you're going to be in big games.
Chiefs came in with, I think, 12 picks in the draft. There's no way that the Kansas City Chiefs are going to roster 12 rookies this year. So we all knew that they were going to be working their way and finding the guys that they wanted. And I think they took two guys, McDuffie and Karlaftis are both rock solid guys with upside. Karlaftis especially as an upside guy. And McDuffie is just a rock solid guy that you can kind of move around in the back end there really comfortably for a team that has lost Tyrann Mathieu and just always looking for cornerback help and everything. Again, a team that's going to be playing from ahead a lot, secondary help and everything, and getting after the quarterback more. So I think two very good picks for them, maneuvered the first round well. Again, they've got some picks still to work with because they're one of the better teams that don't need all these picks. Might try to move some to the future, things like that. But solid first round for them too. And then I assume we're going to move on to the Packers here where
with two second rounders also, I was going to say, that's where they probably take their, and anybody with the Chiefs that's thinking, oh no, what are they going to do? They need to replace Tyreek Hill. Don't worry, there's plenty of receivers that are still available that can help fill that void there. And with the 4 7th round flyers too, I wouldn't rule that out.
Yeah, and then speaking of teams with 2 first rounders that need a quarterback that are contenders, the Packers still no first round wide receivers for them. I saw it's been 20 years now since they took a running back, wide receiver, tight end in the first round. It is pretty cool that they're the first team ever to take 2 players from the same team from the same side of the ball in the first round, 2 guys from Georgia. For my money, I mean, obviously that's the right unit to do it from if you were going to do it from any unit. But for my money, I'd probably take from an impact standpoint, Nakobe Dean and Jordan Davis as a D lineman linebacker combo, as opposed to Quay Walker and Devontae Wyatt. But that's just me.
Well, they didn't have Jordan Davis to choose from, to be fair.
No, but I'm just speaking of the combos. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think people know kind of the book. Like Nakobe Dean, the production was there. If you're betting on the athleticism with Quay Walker, I think you're probably influenced a little bit by like the Micah Parsons sort of mold with his kind of ability as a pass rusher and to kind of fill in different roles that way. Not necessarily being like the pass coverage type of ready-made zone coverage type player that can drop effectively right away. So I think that they're getting these Georgia players, really good athletes. Hard to argue with anybody on that defense, but I'm kind of with you, John, in terms of I'm the sucker for productivity. All right, what else? Other big picks. Alex, I know you and I were both confused when we saw Tyler Smith in the Cowboys blue, and we thought it was Tyron Smith.
Cornering the market on Ty Smiths. But that's a team, talking about the Eagles liking to build on the defensive line. Cowboys have in recent years liked to build on the offensive line, and they want to be able to protect the quarterback. They want to be able to run the ball. It all starts up front for them. And so, using a pick like that seems like a good plan for them.
Any other picks you guys wanted to touch on? The Patriots made a strange one.
I touched on it earlier, but I want to come back to it. The Jets taking Jermaine Johnson here, and not necessarily the Johnson pick, which is interesting that there was so much noise about him going to be a Jet, and it was a lot of talk at number 10. Turns out to be at number 26. Now, that's not the point I want to bring up. The Jets, according to my trade value chart, traded up and won the trade. So I think we consensus said Tennessee made a dumb move, or not a dumb move, but a bad trade, loss of value, giving up AJ Brown. They, in relation to this expected total points chart, lose about a 4th round pick in this trade down with the Jets. So maybe this is a sucker punch to everybody who says always trade down. Maybe you have to put a little asterisk next to it.
We found the limit.
Yeah, it's always, it's like with everything. You could also say always pass, but eventually that will balance itself out. So yeah, I think that even mentioning what we had talked about earlier with not seeing any future first round picks traded in trade ups and stuff like that. Like, I think that this year, at least in this first round, we saw a sort of tempering of the kind of capital that people were throwing around to move up in the draft. And an example of that is you find, typically you'll see 3rd round pick valued, something like that, when you're trading up. And sometimes when you have the opportunities that you did in this first round, you get situations where somebody trades down and actually doesn't get the kind of value. And that is more reflective of sort of the balancing out of the market, if anything, as opposed to necessarily teams making, greater or poor decisions.
If you hit on 17, it doesn't mean that you're going to lose every time, but it's just not going to be a good decision in totality. I think that's fair.
The Johnson thing is interesting. For the guys on the scouting side of this, we had Johnson lower on our board than certainly, there were plenty of mock drafts that suggested that he was going to be a top 10 pick. Was there anything in particular that made him a little bit lower on our board relative to some others?
I know we had some split opinions on him for sure. I know we had Jonathan Miklos, who's still at the company doing baseball stuff now, is a big fan of his, came in really high with him. We had somebody else come in at a slightly lower grade. We kind of split the difference there. But yeah, he's definitely a guy who was a maybe not a late riser, but he's got his fans for sure. There were a lot of people that, some people had him as a top 10 player. Some people thought this was probably the right spot for him all along. And it really sounded like there was a lot of hype lately that it's fascinating. Like at some point, all 3 of the Jets' first round picks were kind of at least thrown around to be a top 10. And obviously, anytime you get 3 first round picks, you're usually going to say that's the team that won the draft, or won day one, or anybody with 2 picks, you won day one. But that does feel like pretty good value for the 3. They obviously saw the reasoning to go up and get them. Saw that a couple times with teams that guys just falling, and you just got to go up and get your guy. So they'd already taken 2. They weren't done. Pretty good value for the 3 there.
I would add to, just like we talked about before, the 3 receivers who played together at Ohio State. Jermaine Johnson played with all these defenders at Georgia, which is kind of crazy to think about too, before he made his way over to Florida State. Just these sort of athletes that were competing with each other at practice every day at those schools. It's kind of mind-boggling. I will say, Alex, we have a 6.7 grade on him. That is a strong starter grade. That is a 7 pass rush ability grade. So I think the advanced stats, as you're probably going to be keen to point out, are quite nice when you look at that.
Yeah, for sure. And we don't want to harp too much on our, big board and the rankings, more about the grade and the sort of the tier that he falls into. So absolutely was a viable pick at the back end of the, first half of the draft, or first half of the first round, and getting him there is absolutely, good value. And even if you are trading up to get him, that loss of value might not be so big of a deal if you're talking about a guy who was falling relative to initial expectations.
Had him as our fifth edge. He went as the fourth edge. We had Karlaftis as our fourth edge. He went as the fifth edge, and they went 2 picks apart or 3 picks apart. So right around that range.
We will wrap up this episode of the Off the Charts Football Podcast. Check out nfldraft.sportsinfosolutions.com. You can check out the updated big board. It's updating as we go throughout the draft. So not only can you see the team pages fill out with the draft picks and the Sonar depth charts being filled out as we go throughout the draft, but you can also see the best available players right now. The top 3 players on the SIS big board: Nakobe Dean, the linebacker out of Georgia; Jaquan Brisker, the safety out of Penn State; and George Pickens, the receiver out of Georgia. Look for those 3 players to come off the board very soon in the second round.
And I'll say real quick, just a final SIS scouting note for me. I want to shout out the whole SIS scouting department. We've been thrilled tonight with how the first round went in terms of our grades. If you're looking at the website, we appreciate it. Only 3 players received grades below a 6.7 for us in the first round. Last year, we had 7 total players, I believe. Those 3 players this year were Quay Walker, Kenny Pickett, and Cole Strange, who we still had as a 6.5 grade. So none lower than a 6.5, only 3 players below a 6.7. We were thrilled with how the first round went out. A lot of our top players went where we expected them to. Still some good players out there, but phenomenal work from everyone involved. We're really excited about that.
Yes, super appreciative of the entire SIS scouting department and the R&D crew that we got with us here right now, and everybody else that did amazing work to put this website together, from our engineers and our product developers and all the way around. For John Todd, Stephen Polacheck, Alex Vigderman, and Justin Stein, I'm Matt Manocherian, and thank you for listening to the latest episode of the Off the Charts Football Podcast.